Welcome everybody to our next paper in this series of the Manchester Classical Association Public Lectures. This week jointly hosted by the Manchester Centre for Public History and Heritage here at Manchester Metropolitan University. And it's an absolutely enormous honour to welcome Dr. Sarah Bond with us this evening, who, as I'm sure you all know, is Associate Professor of History at the University of Iowa in the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. And you will know her from her well-known book of 2016, Trade and Taboo, Disreputable Professionals in the Roman Mediterranean, published with the University of Michigan Press. You'll also know her from various other publications and also from her public history work. And I'm going to put links in the chat box to her blog, History from Below, in which you'll find musings on daily life in the ancient and early medieval Mediterranean from Sarah and other contributors. And also the weekly, I think, newsletter, Past Imperfect, which Sarah is responsible for writing and co-writing, in which we see so many discussions of marginalized people in antiquity, one of Sarah's specialisms. She also has specialisms in late Roman history, epigraphy, late antique law, Roman topography and GIS, digital humanities, and the socio-legal experience of ancient marginal peoples. And she's going to talk to us this evening about women, work and labour, and the epigraphy of women and work, labour and collegia in the Roman Mediterranean. So I'll hand over straight to you, Sarah.
Great, thank you so much. I have my book here, not because I'm trying to sell it. I'm happy to give anybody a PDF who wants it. Just don't tell Ellen, my editor, but I'm happy to just send it to you. I am telling you this because you guys are going to see this picture again here in just a minute. So this is the genesis of how I began to be obsessed with this relief and this photo. But thank you so much for having me here tonight. And certainly for those who are in the US, it is around lunchtime here in Iowa, which is where I am. And I want to talk to you a little bit today about collegia, which is to say voluntary associations, although we are going to also be covering involuntary associations as well to some degree, because we want to recognize that not all associations are created by those people who are members, that sometimes it is forced upon them by domini or by the state or by other organizing factors within Roman society. But this is a very introductory talk to women and work. And then after we talk a little bit about women and occupations, we're going to transition over to talking about their role in and with collegia. But as I say, if you have the link to the right, you will see that the PowerPoint is dense at times, so please feel free to download it and ask me any questions either at the end or via email, which I will be happy to put over in the chat. Okay, so I'm going to get started here. Oops, let's see. Hopefully everybody could give a thumbs up if they see the opening slide that says epigraphy, women, work, and labor unions. Yes? All good? Wonderful. Okay, I even put a U in there just for you guys, right? I added a U to labor, which is not how I normally spell it. Concessions made all around, but I want to talk a little bit today about the epigraphic record and about how we know about women and perhaps some of the questions that we can ask not only about epigraphy, but also about art that might be able to allow us to recover more female identities of those individuals doing work and labor in the Roman world. And I mean Roman world writ large. We will talk a lot about the Latin West for sure, but also inclusive of women within what we might call the Greek East across the Mediterranean. Okay, so let's go to this relief that I love very much. I am a Virginian, from the state of Virginia. When I was in graduate school at the University of North Carolina, I was working on infamia and looking at trade associations. And specifically, we were looking for the cover of my book because many of the reliefs that I loved, which we will see more of in the future, were extremely expensive. And the relief that I was very drawn to is this one from the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts in Richmond, Virginia. And it is a relief of a potter. And if you are referring to a potter in Latin, it would be a figulus or a keramaeus in Greek. And one of the labels for it online and in person said specifically relief of a potter and his wife. And I found this to be a little bit curious because my question to myself really was, isn't she a potter too? Why would we call him a potter and her is just the wife? And I kind of think of this as the ancient equivalent of when you have in books, whole books written out by women, and then in the acknowledgments it says, "Thank you for typing, wife." So this is the recognition that in museum labels and also within scholarship, secondary scholarship, sometimes there is the replication of many of the invisibility factors that we have from antiquity as well, which is that women oftentimes are referred to in very pious ways or simply as an uxor, for instance, rather than by an occupation that they may have helped their husband to do. And so we are going to talk about lots of different occupations, but many of these women are married to men who do the same thing. And this is something that Cam Hawkins has talked about a lot in his work about how workshops within households, within the domus actually function. Oftentimes are both men and women working side by side, oftentimes with enslaved persons, as well as liberti and liberti that help them not only in creating crafts, but also in selling them and marketing them. So thinking a little bit about how we erase women in museum labels, we can also see that part of it is that not all women within the epigraphic record are actually named. And this is very apparent from things like shop signs. This is a marble butcher shop sign, and we saw a close-up of it that I'm sure is familiar to many people on the first slide. And this one has been replicated many times in plaster and is in Rome, in the original at the Museum of Roman Culture, I believe, and this is a copy of it from Dresden. But my question again is the woman who is sitting right over here in this chair, and she has tablets out in wax that she's etching, is she a butcher too? Is she a Lanius, right? Or is she a Lania? And this is very difficult because we aren't told this in any inscription, even though almost all of the literature name him as a Lanius, as a butcher, and of course with all the cuts of meat, but she is clearly doing labor that is connected to the butcher shop and helping out her husband. And this is something, again, that Cam Hawkins has talked a lot about in terms of artisan household economies. And his study of occupational inscriptions in his 2016 book, I think, has been really important to people like Miko Flor, to myself, to Claire Holleran, and many others who are working on the Roman economy in showing that in the epigraphic habit, and that's just a fancy way of saying the habit of writing down inscriptions, we have a lot of mentions of husbands mentioning their wives, and then wives mentioning their husbands. And you can see that there's about, husbands mentioning wives, 36%, and wives mentioning husbands, around 25%. And these are from inscriptions in the Latin West specifically. But you can see that this is quite common to talk about your spouse in conjunction with your job and naming yourself. But as we will also see, men tend to name their occupation, especially in the Latin West, to a much higher degree than we have for the wives, which tend to focus more in the epigraphic record, which is a bias of language, I think, rather than of reality, to focus on the fact that they are pious, that they are chaste, that they are many of the virtues that are expected of Roman women. And we can really see this within Rada Varga's work as well. Her new book that I think this is only maybe a year old, I think it's 2021, but it's called Carving a Professional Identity, the Occupational Epigraphy of the Roman Latin West. She only has 28 inscriptions that mention women in occupations as opposed to 665 for men. And 18 out of 28 of those, so a good majority of them, are specifically for women who are doing medical or administrative functions. And this is a very big part of what women do and how they are a part of the Roman economy at a large level. And that is to say that they frequently serve as midwives. They could be medici, and that is to say female doctors, the masculine being a medicus, of course. They could serve as nurses, as oftentimes enslaved women were wet nurses. And we have a number of reliefs that don't name these women per se as, say, physicians, but we can tell that they are doing labor and work and are certainly medical professionals on some level. I didn't show the relief here, but we have also a relief for a woman who is a pharmacist, and it shows her surrounded by a lot of bowls and different medicinal things that she may be using. So we know that women were extremely invested within the area of medicine and healing, and that oftentimes writers like Galen and many other medical writers depended on women who were midwives and doctors in order to tell them about things. Not always, they didn't always write about them accurately, but to tell them about things such as reproduction and birth and the female body. In addition, we want to recognize the fact that enslaved labor is oftentimes going to result in a lack of representation within the epigraphic record. We have many enslaved persons, but it was still very expensive in order to have an epitaph, for instance, or certainly a dedicatory inscription that was paid for by an enslaved person that was not paid for specifically by the patron or the person who was the dominus or the domina. And we have a lot of representations of people that we think are enslaved women, but we don't know for sure because there are no inscriptions that may tell us 100%. So one of the most famous examples of this is a mosaic from City Rib, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, that are essentially representations of ornatrices, that is in the plural, and the singular is an ornatrix. And they do your hair. They put on makeup for you. They might put a little bit of white lead on your face for you in order to enhance your complexion. But almost all of the inscriptions we have for them, many of which are housed in the baths of Diocletian in Rome, mention that they are servile in status. And so we know that these tend to be women who are held within the domus and are enslaved into their domina, who is likely here in the center. And what this woman is holding up is a very high sheen piece of brass that would have been used as a mirror. So she's actually getting a mirror reflection there for her domina. In addition to enslaved women, we also have a lot of women who are freed women who are working within workshops, but also something that we should recognize is that many times enslaved women are only freed by their masters in order to be married. And this is quite common within Roman law, and we have a lot of examples epigraphically as well, is that oftentimes men will fall in love with the enslaved women in their lives. And I just will, be very clear that this is a coerced marriage. This is a coerced sexual relationship that can never be consensual, to my mind, 100%. But these women are then liberated and turned into a libertà, and they are still married to their dominus. Oftentimes, but probably one of the most famous examples of libertines that continue to have professions is this woman here from Ostia in the 2nd century, and she is a shoemaker. and she's holding up a foot form. And these foot forms you put leather over top of after it has been tanned, and you can turn it into a very nice sandal. You can turn it into a very nice red boot if you're Julius Caesar. You can turn it into a lot of different things here. And she is an example of just one of the many freed women that we know worked within handiworks workshops and actually were themselves considered to be artisans, perhaps alongside oftentimes their husbands. Another space that we should investigate and really think about where women operate and labor is certainly within the area of the inn and within the calpona, that is to say, within taverns and bars and restaurants. And as someone who waited tables for many years to get through undergrad, this is where my heart lies, is with these waitresses who have to deal with these guys and women and men all sitting down in Roman bars. And this is probably one of the most famous examples from Pompeii is a graffito from the bar of Salvius, and a maid is holding a jug, and she says, one customer says, "Over here, hick," right? While another says, "No, it's mine." And the barmaid here replies, "Whoever wants it should take it. Oceanus, come here and drink." And one of the things that is very difficult is to discern exactly the status of many of these women who we have represented, for instance, in wall paintings and graffiti, for instance, and also who are writing the graffiti themselves, what their actual status was, and then what they preferred their nomenclature for their occupation to be. Did they refer to themselves as a barmaid? Did they refer to themselves as an innkeeper? If we don't have an epigraphic record, and most of the time we don't, it's very difficult for us to discern. But Roman law can tell us, at least from above, what Roman men who were legislating these things thought about the status of women who were working within bars. And because I'm a late antique historian, I tend to prefer showing people Roman laws from the late Roman period. And this one is from Constantine, who had given a clarification on the Lex Julia de Adulteriis that had been passed under the Emperor Augustus. And what he says is that wives of tavern owners, that is to say, uxor tabernarii, have a different status in terms of their ability to be held accountable for adultery than those who are not the wives specifically of tabernarii. So we have women within the inn up here who are the wives, and then below that are barmaids, who oftentimes are perceived of and treated as if they are infames. And I think I saw Valerie Hope on this call. So I just want to say the world's expert in infamia, one of them certainly is Valerie Hope. So for more on that to be continued, but we have laws which essentially turn the women and wives into higher status individuals than the barmaids, who oftentimes are what we call an ancilla or a ministra. And this essentially puts them on par with infames, which is a group of people who were very socially but also physically vulnerable to attack and to sexual assault. So not all good things happening in inns and restaurants in the ancient world. But we also have other sources of epigraphic habits and evidence that can tell us a little bit about the perception of the women that were working in these restaurants and that were a part of food service in general and of hospitality. And also, it must be said, of what we might call sex work in the ancient world. This is a very famous sign of a tavern. I tend to follow Garrett Fagan's reading of the sign, which came out in 2017, right before his sadly early death. Garrett, we lost him, side note, a few years ago, but he worked heavily on this tavern sign right before he died. And it says Lucius Callidius Eroticus made this monument while he was still alive for himself and for Fannia Voluptas. And most people have have interpreted this as a joke because it's Lucius, hot stuff lover, and Fania, delight. But it does tell us a little bit about women working hand in hand with a copo or with a coporarius in order to run inns. And what kind of restaurant would we have if we didn't have beer? I live in the Midwest. I used to live in Milwaukee, and I love a pint. And oftentimes we have women serving both beer and wine, even though wine is seen as more higher status. And that is perhaps what is going on here. We don't know for sure if she is a bar waiter or if she is just at her house, but she is taking wine out of a copa, out of a barrel, a cupa, sorry, which is where we get cuperarius, people who make a barrel. And it's also where we get the modern name Cooper as a last name, or people who make barrels. In any case, she is getting wine out of these barrels. And we also have evidence for women who may not have brewed the beer, although that is highly possible based on the Middle Ages and our evidence from late antiquity. But there is one inscription from Trier in Germany that is within a cluster of many other inscriptions for brewers who are called Servisarii. And her name is Hosidia Materna. And it appears as though she is telling us that she is experienced in the craft of brewing. She makes 2 different types of beer. And she made this inscription for herself. Within the area of the Rhineland and within the area of Germany, certainly there was a very big pride in people who brewed beer and people also who traded it as a negotiator. Just a couple more professions before I want to move on to collegia for the second half of our talk. But I also did want to mention women's participation within the area of textile production and textile sale. This is a much older, this is from about, I think, 1600 BCE, a sample of wool fibers that has been dyed in Tyrian purple, the most expensive dye by most accounts within the ancient world. Women wove textiles, and we know this from Greek literature and many other inscriptions as well, but there's much less evidence for whether they actually sold these textiles on open markets like the Agora, or for instance, in the Macellum, the area of the marketplace. But there is some literary and epigraphic evidence that when we bring them together, we can see that perhaps women in some way were beginning to participate specifically through something that we're going to talk about next, which is through the use of unions, voluntary associations that oftentimes handle the purchasing and then resale, if not the production as well, of many of these textiles, some of which are dyed in purple. So one example of this is in and around the area of modern day Thessaloniki and Philippi, which I was very lucky to be able to go to a few years ago. There is a cult surrounding the saint whose name is Saint Lydia. And she's represented here in a little bit of a later Greek icon. So this is not contemporaneous to the time period at all. But Lydia is an independent business owner who acted as a hostess to St. Paul in Philippi, according to Acts. And she is specifically noted as a purple dyer from Thyatira, which is not that far away from Thessaloniki. So the guess here is if she was real, if we think of Acts not as a historical document, but at least gesturing towards the abilities of women and the ability to perhaps produce these textiles, then we see that perhaps Lydia is working in tandem with a lot of the collegia in the area who are dealing purple in and around the area of Thessaloniki. And we also have a lot of production centers for dyes of purple around the area of Tyre. and around the Eastern Mediterranean for sure, historically. So Lydia is mentioned within Acts as a purple seller who takes Paul in, but I think if we begin to see it in tandem with a lot of the epigraphic record, we can see evidence that perhaps because within Latin and in Greek, the plural favors the masculine in the plural rather than the feminine, that perhaps women are within many of the associations that are mentioned as a corpus, as a collective, rather than in the singular. So that's what I would like to talk about now. Collegia. All right. The most famous voluntary association in the world is mythical. It is fictional, and that is because it is cited in the life of Brian. And I put this slide in here because I knew I was talking to a lot of British people. And also because my advisor, I believe, was at Cambridge at the same time as John Cleese. Just throwing that out there. The Judean People's Front and the People's Front of Judea, both of which are mentioned in the life of Brian, even though this is a fictional account, it's one way that I get students to really relate to and think about the wide range of ways that people associate together as a union within the ancient world. And of course, one of the most famous members of the People's Front of Judea, not the Judean People's Front, is Judith, who we have over here to the far right. She is part of a political collegium or association. And what I would like to investigate is whether we think this was a reality or whether Monty Python is based on a modern idea of the membership of guilds and associations. And one thing we have to think about when we think about collegia is the fact that there is a wide terminology. Oftentimes artisans and craftspeople are just put in the plural rather than given a name like a collegium or a corpus or a societas. And I've transliterated the Greek here for you into Latinized Greek, but oftentimes in Greek, we will have a ecclesia, a synagogue, a theasos, a eranos. All of these things are a way of referring to a voluntary association, or in the case of involuntary associations, oftentimes we have them referred to as a familia. So one thing that is very important, and I stand on the shoulders of a giant in Emily Himmelrich, who I will note in the bibliography, some of the best and most amazing work on women and labor in the ancient world has been done by Professor Himmelrich, and she points out specifically that oftentimes the membership of women within collegia are probably more within the domestic collegia, that is to say within the domicile, rather than civic collegia that include things like priesthoods, right? Things that are very much within the public sphere that have kind of smaller magistracies and positions and memberships that are very prestigious. Oftentimes women belong to domestic collegia, we think, rather than necessarily public ones, although we will see that women also were very much allowed to be members in these. We just don't have as much inscriptional evidence telling us about that. But we do know, for instance, that there is no law within the ancient world that keeps women from being allowed into voluntary associations. As Jenyu Liu, Lindsay Mazurek, and many other scholars on collegia have accentuated, there is, for instance, a lot of women that work within cult associations, specifically those that are associated with Isis and Magna Mater. And of course, women are very much a part of the larger collegium of the Bona Dea as well. Some of these associations are fully female, and many of them are actually mixed between men and women. So why have a collegium? Why have this voluntary association that you're a part of? Well, it used to be in the 19th century in the scholarship of people like Theodor Mommsen, and I did not do my hair today in the fashion of Theodor, just for you guys. I wanted to, but Google his picture if you don't know what I'm talking about. In any case, in the 19th century, there was a belief that there were collegia funeraticea, and these are funereal collegia that specifically were created in order only to bury people. And In the scholarship on collegia by people like Jonathan Scott Perry, myself, but also people like Nicholas Tron, we are finding that all collegia oftentimes have multidimensional aspects to them and aren't just able to be defined in one way. Many of them are religious. Many of them provide a funeral and a burial for their members. Many of them have a political aspect to them. That's why Pliny is oftentimes putting down and not allowed to have an extra fire brigade within Pontus Bithynia. That a collegium, that is to say a group, can be formed for almost any reason, but we shouldn't think of them as able to be typologized into just one thing. So even when we talk about occupational collegia, we have to be careful in saying that they just are potters or they just are entertainers, because oftentimes these groups provide functions for communities, especially for demimons of marginalized communities, that we may not always be able to suss out from the inscription alone. A lot of these come on membership lists. These are two, again, I have a bias towards Philippi because I became obsessed with it because we had a volume that came out just this year on Rome and Philippi, but these are the membership lists from Rome and Philippi for one of the collegia within it. We have a number of membership lists which tend to usually be about 95% male, but oftentimes we'll have women interspersed within them as well. We also have a lot of inscriptions that tell us about the visibility and prestige of these collegia in the collective plural, and unfortunately in the masculine, on things like seats. And certainly those here will probably know that Charlotte Rouchet and her work at Aphrodisias is one of the defining studies that shows us how important associations are, not only within the Latin West, but also within the Greek East, on things like having special seating, essentially box seats that are just for these special collegia. And this is one, Theodotus, who is head of the bronzesmiths or the goldsmiths, we aren't 100% sure. And that is because you could get prestige from having not only a membership, but also a position within your local group of artisans. And we also see that women are incorporated in reliefs that show us various collegia, especially of entertainers. So this is one of the most famous examples that is probably a larger collegium of entertainers that is run by a funeral director right here, who is directing the whole funeral. But we have female mourners who are over here. We have beer carriers, we have musicians over here, and they're all in a moving kind of parade and circus, which is kind of the performance of a biography that is the Roman funeral procession. Oftentimes, this is where we would also have gladiators in the earlier Republic, and people performing in various ways the life of the individual that had died. But women oftentimes are connected to the various collegia of entertainers, that is to say actors, musicians, etc., who are hired by a designator, that is to say the funeral director over here, in order to coordinate a funeral procession. So you just call up, not literally, but you just get a praeco, a crier, to go and collect together all of these different groups. And it was a way of mobilizing labor as quickly as possible. In addition, I just want to give a shout out to the fact that there were collegia that were only for women. We don't have a lot of evidence for them, but probably the most famous is this 1st or 2nd century inscription from Rome that refers back to the Collegium Mulierum, so the Collegium of women. So we know that there were seats just for women within collegia as well, and certainly that was the case with certain priesthoods and priestesses who were, for instance, the Bonadea. Of course, the Vestal Virgins are themselves a collegium of priestesses as well. And I should note that in addition to being a participant and a member within a collegium, women also had the chance to be patroni, that is to say patrons of collegia. And this is something that I wrote about for my master's thesis, and Lord help me, this was written in 2007. So I have linked to it at the end if you want to read my master's thesis on female municipal patronage in North Africa, but you do not have to. This is certainly something that we know, that the traditional male role that women began to play, especially in the 1st and 2nd centuries, was that of patrona collegii. An inscription from Picenum that I have here indicates the manner in which traditionally female epithets, such as sanctissima and piissima, continue to be applied to women even when fulfilling roles outside the domus. And what we see here is that Gaius Vetus Polus erected this for his most virtuous wife, along with Gaius Vettius Polus, in honor of his mother, whose name is Aliana Berenike, daughter of Titus, the most pious patron of the Association of Fabri and Centenarii. And this is probably builders and carpenters along with textile workers is probably what we have based on a lot of the work of Genyu Liu. But the place was designated by decree of decurions, and I should note as well that perhaps the most famous example of a patroness of a collegium is certainly Eumachia, who was a sacerdos publica, a benefactress, and a patrona of a collegium of fullers within the city of Pompeii. Eumachia had inherited large sums of money from her husband and continued to help manage the family's brick business even after her father had died. And probably this was an attempt to get her son elected around 2 CE. She erected a large building in the Forum of Pompeii. And patrons of collegia often erected buildings for associations they patronized and were honored with statues, such as the statue that the Fullers of Pompeii erected for Eumachia herself. Claudia Justa, for instance, was honored with a statue by the Dendrophoras, that is to say the wood sellers of a city within Italy, and another woman named Aemilia Senesia was honored for her benefactions by the Dendrophoroi of the Italian city of Brixia. So we do have evidence for female patrons of these collegia, and not just as women being members within them. Okay, as I'm wrapping up here in the last 5 to 7 minutes here, I want to transition to a period that I'm a little bit more comfortable with, which is to say early Christianity and the late Roman world. This is something that I think is very important, is to see how the Roman proclivity towards creating collegia, and the Roman legal proclivity for disbanding collegia, because we have, if we had a whole nother 60 minutes, we could talk about the legislation that formulates them. But Romans form groups, they form clubs, and many times these collegia and the setup, at least the anatomy of a collegium, is what then transitions, in my mind, even though, as we will see, people have argued very strongly against this, that the collegium is what allows people within the domus to transfer to what we call house churches in the early period of Christianity. And rather than categorizing each collegium separately, we oftentimes have to see that they could have formed many different types of religious functions within the domicile and done many different things. And one thing that is important to note is that we have house churches that are commemorated, for instance, by a woman named Sergia Paulina. And she is from the senatorial ordo, and we have a number of these inscriptions. This is just one of them. And out of the 1,932 women listed in the Prosopographia Imperii Romani, known to many of us simply as the PIR, there is a very few number of women who are recognized as people who patronized collegia or who were a part of them. But over a half century ago, historians Marta Sordi and Maria Luisa Cavieghilo, argued that Paulina's function in this collegium that you see here was facilitating a Christian collegium on her early church within her own property. So essentially, she owns an apartment block. And within the apartment block, there is a collegium that then many believe turned into what we might call later an early Christian congregation and a church. And I think it's about 9 or 10 inscriptions that are later put up within the coimatorium that she is buried within. But it notably mentions the fact that it is her association held within her household. So we have these references to Christianity that are nearby and certainly tell us that perhaps collegia were part of the organizational process that transitioned into what we might call early Christian churches. And certainly women were part of many later churches. And even though we may not think of it this way, I do think of the clergy as an occupation that we need to recognize as part of the labor of the Roman world. And as I've talked about extensively in my book, oftentimes early clerics have a part-time job and they have the job of being a cleric. So many times we have female deaconesses who are serving within these early churches, and much of the evidence for these females within the diaconia are within the Eastern Mediterranean. This is just one example again from Philippi, named Agathe, but she's married to a treasurer and to a linen worker. So does that mean that Agathe also is making linen, creating linen and selling it along with her husband? Maybe, probably, but almost all clerics in the period of the 4th, 5th century moonlight as something else. You can't have a full-time job as a cleric oftentimes until later within early Christianity. And even though we begin to have a decrease in female clerics and their citation after the 6th century, I think it's important to see that women do hold these positions of status within what we might call a collegium of early Christians. And just ending up here, I want to go back to marriage and husbands and whether women can be considered to be the laborers that they are married to. And I would say, at least within Roman law, oftentimes women are tied to the status of their husband if they have a certain trade. So both of these examples are from the CJ, and I can give you at least 4 more for many other trades, but the one from 365 notes that women who marry weavers are then warned that they are going to become the low birth of a weaver. So we begin to see the construction of what A.H.M. Jones referred to as essentially a caste system. I don't think that the caste system is, I think that's too strong a language. I think that probably we have to see this as kind of an ordo that is being created, that is being perpetuated of trades in the late Roman Empire, especially trades that are necessary to the state. So the production of purple, the production of arms in fabricae, for instance, various types of clothing, all of these become, and food processing become very important. And oftentimes women are married to men who do these things and they help them in some way, but certainly are tied to them as the same legal status once they marry them. And this second example is from 380, says, we order that no women of noble station must lose the honor of her native liberty by marriage with a minter, that is to say, a mint worker that works on minting coinage. So all of these things to say is that men and women, husband and wives, even though we don't often think of it, their occupations are intimately tied oftentimes with their status and with their day-to-day lives. Ending here, one of my favorite inscriptions is from the city of Rome and mentions a margaritarius, not someone who makes margaritas, which I love to drink, but this is somebody who sells pearls, and an example of which you have here to the right along the Sacred Way. And it was erected under the guidance of Fufia Galla, his wife, and of Atimetus and Abascantus, his freedmen. What most people think is that this is probably a workshop of pearl sellers, margaritarii, that are working along the sacred way in Rome, and that Fufia Gala, in all likelihood, is helping in some way, just like we have with the butchers at the very beginning, the woman who is taking down accounts, or with our potter with which we started off the talk. So while I haven't given a complete overview of all women who worked in the ancient world and all collegia that had women as members, I hope that today I have at least begun to broach the subject of how we can recover more invisible women that may not be mentioned in the epigraphic record and certainly are missing from the literary record, to find more of them, especially within the Latin West and within the areas of the Eastern Mediterranean, through association with their husbands. So thank you guys very much. And I look forward to talking a little bit more. And here's a very dense, I said abbreviated bibliography, but I can give you a much longer one if you would need. And I'm happy to answer questions and to talk a little bit about what we just discussed. Thank you.